us to have a very distinguished speaker. We have Alexandr Swobода from Geneva. For those of you who don't know Alexander, he's a very distinguished macroeconomist and macroeconomic policy economist. He's graduated from Yale and then taught in many distinguished economics departments and business schools around the world, including Chicago, Harvard, and LSE. And in the last 20 years, he's mostly operated back from his home place in Geneva, where he was a director of the Institute for Graduate Studies. You translated like this, yes.
Something like that. Graduate Institute.
Graduate Institute, yes. That's,
no, it's called of International and Development Studies.
Okay, yeah, and where he's now a professor. He's also in the last at least 20 years, but also before, he's been very active in advising IMF, evaluating IMF, suggesting the IMF reform, and as always in crisis, the time for this advice has come again. And I would also mention the recent book that Alexander has edited with Peter Cannon of Princeton on the future of international financial system. And again, as we know now, G20 and other bodies discuss this as well. And Alexander will talk today exactly about these issues, about global imbalances and about the future of international policy response to the crisis. And thank you very much for coming. We appreciate this, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
We totally have something like 90 minutes, but you can split it between questions and talk.
Okay, I'll try not to speak too long.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sergey. For this introduction, I should add just one thing, is that I'm now a Professor Emeritus, and I'm retired from active life, so I can have the luxury to come and visit you in Moscow and spend some time here if I wasn't stupid enough to forget to get a visa, so that I could only fly today. I would have loved to attend a few of the sessions at your research conference to learn what you're doing. And also,
the great news, you did get that visa.
Thanks for your help. And I guess I'm very flattered to be here. I would not have understood half of the things that you're talking about, because I left formal economics some time back. So let me give you some views which are more reflective than actually very technical, and that will range a bit broader. Now that I've shown you that I own a suit, if you will allow me, I'll take my coat off. And let me try to outline what I'm going to talk about today. The first thing is, I want to very quickly go over what do we mean by global imbalances, and the specific meaning it has taken on in the past 10 years or so. The second question I want to look at is, well, why should we worry about global imbalances? And maybe that will lead us to think that there are good imbalances and bad imbalances. Thirdly, if we think we have bad imbalances, what is it that we can or should do to try and reduce them? Fourth, when we talk about that, there will be brought to a question about, shouldn't there be some coordination among policies among countries? After all, one country's surplus is another one's deficit. One country's exchange rate with another is 1 over the exchange rate of that second country with it. So that immediately says, well, maybe we should think a little bit about coordinating policies if we're in this international field. What is the case for it, and so on. And lastly, after we've seen, well, that coordination is very, very difficult. Is there any hope for it? And would that hope perhaps come from the IMF? And how should we want the IMF to mend its operations to achieve that goal? So let me turn to the first topic, global imbalances, an overview. Now, there's somebody whom you probably, very few of you will have heard about, an economist called Fritz Machlup, an Austrian who taught at Princeton University for most of his later life, after Vienna, I guess. And he used to be a fan of semantics and insisted very much on people trying to give precise definitions of the words they use before they use them. And he wrote a number of articles, and he once called, or probably several times, concepts like disequilibrium in the balance of payments, fundamental equilibrium in the balance of payments, equilibrium exchange rate, and so on. He called those weasel words and jargon, because various people use those words in various meanings. For instance, why should balance, and that is really the object of this, why should a balance of payments equilibrium in the sense of zero deficit or surplus in the overall balance of payments be equilibrium? Or, in today's discussion, why should zero current account surpluses or deficits be balance? The connotation of imbalance is, to our Cartesian way of thinking, something bad. You know, it's not quite balanced. We like balance, we like symmetry and so on, but why? Why if one country has a surplus, why is that imbalance? Okay, or if it has a deficit, why is it imbalance? In what sense? And I think we have to be, in this whole topic, extremely careful about that. Now let's start with something we all know, but which too often is forgotten in sort of popular analysis of the current situation. And that is that a current account, the current account of a country, is equal to the excess of, is equal to the excess of its income over the expenditure by its residents. Okay? And that's a very simple concept which translates into saying it's the difference between national saving and national investment. We all have a balance of payments. My balance of payments is negative if I spend more than I earn, and therefore I have a deficit on the on my current account, which I have to compensate in some way or another by having a capital inflow, by borrowing or selling some assets, or by selling cash, by losing some international, selling some international reserves at a country's level. Now, the obvious lesson from that is that if you want to change a current account, for instance, if you want to eliminate or reduce a current account deficit, you have to reduce expenditure, national expenditure, relative to national income. Now, there are various ways you can do it, and there are some ways that are more painful if you do it by, if at the same time you reduce income a lot, then you have to reduce national expenditure and compress consumption, investment, and so on even more. But that, whatever means you want to use to change a current account balance, you have to work on the national expenditure relative to income. That will be very important later on, because the question will be, well, what is the most efficient way of doing that? Now, coming back to global imbalances. When in the current discussion and you have global imbalances, as you said, Sergey, that's the most dangerous part of the day. We don't need any little variation in the current account of a country. What people mean is that there is a persistent, large surplus in the balance of payments in one part of the world, matched, of course, by a similar balance of payments, or the same, but reverse in sign, deficit in the rest of the world. And you want large amounts, you want it to be persistent, and then you say, well, these are what we're going to call global imbalances. Now, whether they are bad or good is another story to which we come, but that's what is usually meant by that. The last point is here that of course, a prominent example of that is the rising US current account deficit over the past 15 or 20 years. Now, that's a picture of the US current account deficit over the past 95, over the past 15 years. And what you can see here is that we start with a moderate current account deficit at the beginning of this period, and then we have a precipitous plunge, but basically a big downward trend until 2006 or so, or 2007, to the extent where the current account deficit of the United States reaches some 6 or 7% of the US GDP. Now, the US is, at the beginning of that period, was perhaps 25% of the world economy. It's now 20% of the world economy, or take 30 to 25. Depends whether you use purchasing power parity, which for these types of exercise probably you don't want to do. You want to use current exchange rates. That changes a bit the picture. And then you see from 2007 on a big increase, a decrease in the deficit. Okay, it's still a significant part of the deficit, and you can see that better here, which I take this from the latest World Economic Outlook from the IMF, where you have in principle, the balance of payments, big deficits and surpluses by groups of countries over the period 1996, I guess, to the present, plus projections for the future. Now, if you look at this figure, what you see is, let's forget about the projections for a moment, and let's just look at the actual evolution. You can see that there is a major deficit country in this dark blue or violet color, and that's the United States. Okay? What are the sources of the surpluses? They are first this red sort of line here. That's the oil producers, okay, including Russia, I suppose. You have then this yellow line. This is DEU, that is developed European Union, the developed countries in the European Union, plus Japan. And finally, up here, you've got China and the emerging Asia countries. Okay? And China is a large proportion of that. So you can see that the counterpart to the US deficits is or has been until recently 3 groups of countries: Europe, if you wish, developed Europe, the oil producers, and China and East Asia. Okay? You also have, towards the end of the period, some deficits. Deficits arising in a number of other countries. This is this blue line here. You can even have blips where suddenly the oil producers have deficits, they don't absorb as much as before. I mean, they absorb more than they did before of their oil revenues. Now, what's also interesting is what's happening after 2008. In 2009-10, these are the projections of the IMF. They are the projections which forecast a decrease in the total amount of global imbalances, a shift in those global imbalances even more than before towards China and East Asia on the surplus side, a reduced deficit in the United States, and well, that's the most significant thing to be seen here. Now there's one last thing about this chart which is interesting, which is you have this line here is the world's deficit or surplus with, presumably with Mars or the moon or I don't know where. It's a statistical discrepancy, and it is the sum of all the measured current account surpluses and deficits, which of course, if we got our statistical things right, should be 0. Well, it isn't 0, and it used to be that the world had a deficit, okay, below the line. It then moved into a surplus. The surplus tended to go a little bit away, in a way, and it's projected to increase. Now, that's weird, okay? It's weird that it is projected to increase. Well, these projected figures come out of the various models the IMF uses to predict future output. Then they take marginal propensities to import, to save, blah, 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 and they calculate their projections on that basis. Now, the result is this, and that is a little bit disturbing, because it says that there are more surplus countries than there is in the diagram. But if there are more surplus countries, there are also more deficit countries. I mean, those surpluses have to be matched by deficits. So that says perhaps the quote-unquote imbalances that will actually arise will be larger than what is projected here, and we may be far from over the troubles that the IMF thinks we have. Okay, now enough figures. Let's try to think a little bit about it. Why would we worry? Why would we worry? It's clear that not every imbalance is worrisome. And we shouldn't worry if we have so-called good imbalances. Now, what are those? Those are imbalances that basically reflect private decisions, or commercially induced, at least, decisions, in the absence of externalities and distortions. Then, in fact, we would think that so-called imbalances are a good thing because they reflect private choices, and in the case of the current accounts, intertemporal choices between consumption today and consumption tomorrow, etc. And then correspondingly, capital flows, the corresponding capital flows are really good things because they allow to reconcile the time preferences and productivities of lenders and borrowers. It makes these capital flows would allow portfolios to be better diversified, shocks to income in various countries to be insured against by movements in the current account, and more generally, it would allow capital to flow from where it is abundant to where it is scarce. Of course, the current account surplus must be equal to the capital account deficit, including reserve changes if there are changes in international reserves. Now, and in fact, people used to think that this was the sort of thing that was a good thing, and that you can look at it through the lens of the stages of the balance of payments sort of theory or hypothesis, which people had in textbooks 40, 50 years ago. You still find them in some of the development books. This is something that I sort of updated from 1985 World Development Report of the World Bank. And you go from being a young debtor as a country starts growing, it brings in capital. That means there is a big capital inflow. That finances a trade deficit, allows it to invest and so on. It then moves to the next stage as a mature debtor, etc., until it becomes an old, decadent, mature creditor. Here at the end, where it can basically live off its past foreign investment, and its net asset position doesn't change anymore. Well, these cycles can take years and years, and it used to be thought that this is part of the development process. Okay, so maybe you would be a young debtor for 10 years, then another 10 years, and so on and so forth. Say almost 50 years of moving through those stages, and through these stages you have persistent, large imbalances. That's of course what you had in the balance of payments of the UK over the end of the second half of the 19th century, or even the beginning of the 19th century into the 20th century, until the US took over, and you had the same sort of long stages in terms of the US. And that is not something that we would worry about. On the contrary, we would call those imbalances extremely favorable. They're good imbalances. So, what do we mean by bad imbalances? Well, the bad imbalances, by contrast, reflect distortions, externalities, and basically some policy distortions or bad policies somewhere which spill over onto the rest of the world and into the current account. Maybe a current account surplus reflects distortionary taxes, implicit or explicit, on consumption, as you have with various subsidies on capital, etc. in China. Maybe they reflect excessive, whatever that may mean, government deficits, as you had at least sometimes in the United States with the twin, so-called US twin deficits.
Why
now, of course,
bad?
Sorry?
Why are externalities bad? Distortions are bad. Why?
Negative externalities. Okay. Negative externalities. Now, you're of course quite right. Now, what in the eyes of one observer may be a bad imbalance, in the eyes of another one may be a good one, and that's part of the difficulty here. Now, it's often said that bad imbalances are unsustainable. So, one question is, if they, I think people refer to Mark Twain, or I don't remember to whom, saying if it ain't sustainable, it won't be sustainable. Maybe it's Herb Stein or somebody, I don't remember who said that first. So why worry, okay? Because anyway, it will, they will take care of themselves because they tend not to be sustainable. Well, let's still ask why we should worry. We'll come back to that last question. First, one thing that worries people is the so-called uphill flow of capital. Remember that a current account deficit means that you're borrowing from the rest of the world. If you have a current account surplus, you're lending to the rest of the world. At the moment, the world is lending, and the developing world is lending to, China is lending to the United States. Is that good or not? Okay. Well, maybe to jump to that point, that depends, sorry, I was confused at the point. Maybe we should jump to this, the Bretton Woods II thesis. According to the Bretton Woods II thesis, that's a good thing. It reflects a deliberate policy on the part of China, which is not bad for the rest of the world. It's part of the new system. The US provides liquidity to the rest of the system. It gets some benefits in terms of seniorage. The periphery in exchange can export more, have faster development, and so on. So everything is fine. Now, again, it could be bad because it reflects, as we just said, distortions in national policies. Suppose that you have policies that distort choices between saving and consuming, and that those distorted in favor of consuming more, then probably in the long run there is a welfare loss to that, and you could, and that will be reflected in your current account deficit, or at least a surplus that is less than optimal from a welfare point of view. Now, one of the negative externalities, to come back to the externalities before, is that some of these imbalances may, through various mechanisms, be the source of instability in the international financial system, and they might well have been recently. Then there is the what is now being called the Bernanke thesis of, I guess, 2005, where he wrote a paper suggesting that the problem was that there was excessive saving in the rest of the world, pushing basically capital towards the advanced countries, the United States in particular, and that this savings glut was had the very bad consequence of encouraging the United States to borrow more than it otherwise would have. In other words, the United States was a hero and poor hero of the story because it had to be the borrower of last resort and rendered that service to the rest of the world where the saving from the rest of the world couldn't have gone. Now, these sorts of stories always leave me a little bit doubtful because basically it takes two to tango. You can either talk about excessive saving or deficient investment, and demand must somehow match supply, and the demand for those savings from China did come from somewhere. It was not something that was shoved down the throat of the United States. So that's the saving glut versus fiscal profligacy. We talked about Bretton Woods' benign thesis. Now, the real worry, I suppose, the real worry about what is unsustainable won't be sustained, is that the unwinding of an unsustainable situation may be extremely painful and maybe extremely costly. Now, for a number of years, economists have had a catastrophe theory about the global imbalances, loss of confidence in the dollar because of both the government deficit and the current account deficit in the United States, a collapse of the dollar, a sharp rise in interest rates in the United States as the dollar depreciates. Trade will not react fast enough in the United States. That will create recession in the United States. That recession will spread to the rest of the world and we'll have a catastrophe. Well, we've had a sort of catastrophe. It didn't come about that particular way. But that was the fear, and that was one of the main arguments that people have used to say, well, we better worry about those global imbalances and do something about it. Now, next question is, what should we do about it? Well, we can think of, yes?
Next question. So somehow here, for me, it's not clear whether, say, what's your opinion about? Do you believe those stories that the catastrophe scenario is a real one that we should worry about, or we just entertain in terms of thinking that what happens if this thing is right? Because the way you talk about it is saying, look, interest rates in the United States, in case of catastrophe, they go up. Question is, where those money they're taking out of the United States will go? Is there Europe or Japan or somewhere that will accommodate those money? If not, why not again in the US? So what makes this catastrophe? We talk about goods and imbalance of payments, and again, there must be some kind of mechanism for it.
Okay, let me try to answer this. The idea here is the money. It's not that the money won't come back to the United States, quote unquote, because what happens is simply a loss of confidence on this, and you don't even have to have many transactions or a major change in capital flows. You have an abrupt, you're not willing to lend to the United States except at much higher rates of interest than before because there is a lot of a loss of confidence. That loss of confidence is related to these types of policies where people start saying, well, it can't go any longer. And then you have a snowball rolling. Now, people take out their money from the United States or try to take out their money from the United States, but they can't. And the result is simply that the assets that they hold are worth much less. Okay? So that means two things. It means, one, that the interest rates at which US businesses can borrow are much higher. Okay? And that you have losses on the dollar assets in the rest of the world, which can be substantial. And all that can contribute to recession or depression or whatever. And then the question is, how do you cope with that? Well, by the time it occurs, it's sort of too late to cope with it. You'll have to eat the consequences. Now, I think part of that story was exaggerated for one particular reason. Now, ever since DSGE models came in to estimate what was needed to correct the US balance of payments deficit through a depreciation of the dollar, there were some really scary scenarios being built in. And if you look at what these models predict as the consequence of a rebalancing of the current account of the United States, if not to 0 to 3% instead of 6% of GDP, is a massive depreciation of the dollar, 30–35% in real terms. And that story has been told ever since the otherwise extremely nice work of Opsfeld and Rogoff on the intertemporal approach to the current account. The problem is using these types of models you have models with endowments, and there is no substitution in production, basically. And all the substitution has to come from changes in consumption triggered by changes in relative prices. And I think that's probably very much an overestimate of what changes in the dollar are required if there was some policy to redress the US current account imbalance, or the US and the rest of the world's current account imbalances. Okay. So I didn't see that catastrophe scenario in the sense of a major depreciation of the dollar. Some, but not that much. And that's probably one of the reasons it didn't occur. We've had other problems with the financial system instead, which were, well, no, there are connections, but that would take us too long. Okay, now, the sort of, if you want to do something about it, let's come back to what we said before. The current account is the difference between national expenditure and national income. So, if you want to do something about it, the standard recipe would be for the surplus countries to expand, and that will expand expenditure, okay? And that will reduce the surplus. And for the deficit countries to reduce the expenditure, their expenditure, and that will reduce their deficit. Now, that's fine. Now, the next question is, there are many other questions, but the next question is, through what instrument do you want to affect the domestic expenditure? And here, if you take a long-run view, the instrument of choice is fiscal policy. That is the simple principle that you want to attack a distortion at source. If you have a distortion in saving and investment, you want to take the national saving and national investment. You want to take measures that directly affect national saving and national investment. Now, the interesting thing about that, and that could be either the government budget or the structure of taxes and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing about that is that this holds irrespective of the exchange rate regime. If you are interested in the current account, and you can check it in the Mundell-Fleming model on the fixed and flexible exchange rates, etc. What matters is fiscal policy. Monetary policy matters also in the short run, but if you want to look at the final result, you want to look mainly at fiscal policy. But two problems. At the country level, you have a conflict between internal and external, or you can have a conflict between internal and external balance. The solution could be some sort of monetary fiscal assignment a la Mundell and the fixed exchange rates. You use monetary policy for the balance of payments. You use fiscal policy for internal balance, that is for the level of employment and the price level. Under floating exchange rates, you can use both policies for internal balance. But wait, if you still want to have the current account on top, you're asking, you still have to use fiscal policy. Now, I think Now, the second issue is what we've already mentioned, is that one country's surplus is the rest of the world's deficit. One country's depreciation is another of the rest of the world's appreciation. Okay? Now, that wouldn't pose many. So you ask, well, should we have deficit countries do one thing, surplus countries another, or what? Well, there is a very simple solution, and this is a so-called burden of adjustment, sharing the burden of adjustment problem. Many of those were, in fact, delineated by Bob Mondale. And the question is, should the deficit country deflate? Should the surplus country inflate? Should both of them do a little bit? How do we know? Well, there is a simple situation, which is if one country has if the world is in a state of unemployment in general, then the burden of adjustment should fall on the deficit, on the surplus countries, because the surplus countries are asked to expand. So you want them to expand more than the deficit countries contract. Or you want both of them to expand, but you want the surplus country to expand more than the deficit country in terms of expenditure policy. So that is nice, but it sort of breaks down if one country is in unemployment and the other one has inflationary tendencies. Then the rule isn't there anymore, and you don't know quite how to assign, if you wish, the burden of adjustment between the two countries or the end countries in the world. Well, one possible solution is policy coordination. Well, there is, I think, as we all know, a general case for policy coordination, which arises from the interdependence among countries. There is the externalities, if you wish, that one country's policies, if it's large enough, if it's not a very small country, will affect what's happening in the rest of the world. And the game theoretic approach to this issue is to say, well, if we look at that, basically a cooperative solution is always better than a non-cooperative solution. A cooperative solution is better than a Nash equilibrium. The latter may be dominated by a Stackelberg leadership type of equilibrium, but both the Nash and the Stackelberg are dominated by a cooperative solution. So what the game theory type of approach says in the very simplest ways is let's try to find a cooperative solution. But then you get all the prisoner's dilemma type of problems, can you repetitive games, etc., etc., etc. But the basic issue is that. Now, there are many difficulties with that approach, with the game theoretic approach in practice. First, we have uncertainty, and it's hard to model in those games of taking into account. As many people have tried to show empirically, if you have model disagreement or uncertainty about what is a true model of the world, if you have disagreement about some of the goals and strategic behavior, the attempt at coordinating policy with some cooperative rules may not produce better outcomes than non-cooperative solutions. On average, it does produce better outcomes, but still there are many cases where the outcomes will be worse if you coordinate than if you don't coordinate. Anyway, the types of coordination that are required in these types of models are totally unrealistic in the real world. And I would prefer to see, in terms of policy coordination, a targets and instruments approach, a la Mead-Tinbergen or a la Mandel. The Mead-Tinbergen principle is a very simple one. You don't usually kill two birds with one stone. You have to have as many instruments of policy as you have targets of policy. And independent targets, independent instruments, so that the two birds are not flying at the same place, and the one stone can then hit them. Now, this means that one of the prime tasks of policy is to have enough instruments. And one of the advantages of that is that it avoids some of the trade-offs that you have in the so-called game theoretic approach. In the game theoretic approach, the essence of the problem is that you have a trade-off which implies gains in the welfare of one country and losses for the other along the contract line. Of course, the idea is, let's get to the contract line first. Okay. But it's hard enough to get to the contract line, and then it's hard enough to agree on some point on the contract line. If the world were a little bit simpler, if we could have enough targets and enough instruments, we could at least move towards our targets simultaneously in all countries in this particular example. Well, this is where the Mandel assignment problem comes in, which says, well, how do we approach that desirable equilibrium where we hit the targets? How do we design a system that will be dynamically stable and which will allow you to reach, in Mandel's example, internal and external balance at the same time? And that means using specific instruments for specific purposes, assigning instruments to targets in such a way as to stabilize the system. It will become apparent in a second why I'm making those points. Now, I think that approach would be a pragmatic one, and if you want to have coordination among countries on a major scale about big problems like global imbalances, I think the only thing that you can hope for is some packages where countries agree to move into a particular direction. They also have to make it credible. Not that they're going to move their instruments or their policies in very specific amounts, but at least in the right direction. And that these moves respect those two principles above. That was attempted to, even then it's not very simple, that was attempted in the Plaza Accord, except that many of the elements of the package were not respected and so on. But that's one example. Now, consider the situation, I wouldn't say in the last year or so, because the crisis has intervened and complicated things immensely. But consider the situation in, for instance, 2006 or 2007. And suppose you were sort of a cosmopolitan god policymaker who can make recommendations as to which way the policies of various countries could move. So you sit down and you look at, well, how are the current account imbalances, how should they be, what's global demand, is world demand sufficiently large, is it too small, how is it distributed across countries? That goes a little bit with with the direction of current account imbalances? Are there specific supply bottlenecks here and there, which means that if we shifted demand appropriately, supply would not respond, etc. Then what you would do is, I won't develop the whole argument here, but what you would do is basically you would say, well, let's sort of look at the world as a world, and if we really believe we have an integrated world economy, we have sort of a sophisticated neo-Keynesian one-world economy, or if you're an old fogey like me, ISLM type of economy, and then it's divided in between regions in various ways. What really counts is what is the sum of the fiscal stances in the world to determine the overall level of aggregate demand. Okay? And then how these fiscal stances and rather the spending that they induce or to some extent control is distributed relative to the outputs of the various individual countries is what counts. Or if you wish, you can show that in the long run, in some very simple models, it's a sum of the fiscal stances that determines world output. It's the ratio of fiscal stances that determines current account equilibrium. Then you would make these types of recommendations, and the example of that time, you would recommend the we're pretty near full employment, perhaps a slight tendency for overheating in the world economy. You would probably say, well, the United States should cut its fiscal deficit somewhat, or significantly. That may be helped, or should change the structure of its taxation to encourage more saving. Saving of households is getting dangerously low. In emerging Asia, it's clear that the type of policy they have now is probably is generating too largely a current account surplus and generating too many international reserves with a fixed exchange rate. So here the spending, domestic consumption and investment should be encouraged. You'd say, well, what is Europe? Europe is strange because it's a bit anemic. Output doesn't respond very well. Maybe there have to be some labor market reforms. There are supply bottlenecks in Europe and so on. So that's what should be done in that region of the world. And the interesting thing is that these recommendations would probably match what most economists in those regions or countries would think the countries should do for their own benefit. So if they acted in their own self-interest, if you wish, you wouldn't need really fiscal coordination.
Demonstrate it for China?
Sorry?
Could you demonstrate it for China?
I can't demonstrate anything.
No,
I mean, if you consider China, I mean, even reasonable people. I mean, there are some nuts in the U.S. Congress who want China, I mean, to revalue, and that will solve all the problems of the world. That's nonsense, of course. The Chinese have a development model, quote unquote, that has worked well, but it's sort of getting its limits. It's getting its limits in the sense that by the measure of most people, and here think of reasonable people like Ishwar Prasad, who probably is a person who knows everything you want to know about China and so on, would say, okay, investment has become too large. There are some reforms to that. Consumption has to be pushed a bit. Public spending on social security and so on should go up, and probably some revaluation would be helpful. A, to accommodate a decrease in the current account surplus, and B, to sort of moderate the inflationary pressures that are coming out of the current policy of sterilizing the reserve inflows into China. And I think there are quite a few Chinese who would agree with this diagnosis and say it's reasonable. You obviously would not.
Sure. I don't think so. But evaluation is a good policy for China. China tries to liberate yuan as much as possible. This is a very important feature of their policy. It is a cornerstone of the development.
That's quite correct, and but it is getting to be a cornerstone where the costs of which are beginning to outweigh the benefits. I think even for the Chinese themselves, they've said so themselves. Of course, they say in due time, and we know that Chinese time is very long, but still, I think the let's say that Chinese economists are beginning to agree with that point of view. I would say that they could keep probably their exchange rate where it is. Doesn't disturb me very much. But I would want them to, I mean, this is my point of view, in that case, not to sterilize as much. Because I think, and we'll come to that in my last point, which I should come to in a second. Yes.
So, you kind of say, so here's ideal solution, if I can say. But then if you think about, interest of the countries, you can find 3 reasons why each country might not want to follow. One thing is ideal for somebody else, but not for the country. So individually, country might not find it reasonable for itself. Second thing, country might be at the position to influence the solution. Whether it's supply bottleneck or some other bottleneck, country may be strategic in adjusting its policy, trying to get additional benefit. And the third thing, individual decision for the country might not think that everyone else will follow this. And if they think that everyone else will follow something else, then the ideal solution is just ideal. No one would willing to follow.
Thank you for giving my next slide. Now, in addition to the various other problems that I talked about before, there are some problems, and you just mentioned most of them. What makes, the first one is that the basic problem, of course, is that we have independent policy making by nations in a world that is getting economically coordinated. That is both the motivation for coordination and also the difficulty of coordination, because of course each country is considering itself to be sovereign or wants to limit its lack of sovereignty as much as possible. Whether its actual independence is greater or less when it coordinates and it doesn't is something that is another question which Dick Cooper in his original piece on interdependence and policy coordination already noted. The independence may be more symbolic than real, at least in an economic sense. One reason it's difficult, you may have inconsistent goals for shared variables. That is, I started saying, well, this is what each country should do. It should reduce its deficit or its surplus. And of course, the extent to which they want to reduce or increase their surpluses may be inconsistent with each other, and that's very hard to reconcile. And they may even, and that's a Chinese example, say, to hell with it, I want to increase. So it is difficult. And basically, the way I've been talking about it, I've been talking about coordinating fiscal policies. Now, fiscal policies are already very difficult to change within a country at the domestic level. At an international level, it's even more difficult. Although one could say, if you take the example of the Growth and Stability Pact, that one way you can sort of force yourself to take difficult decisions with respect to fiscal policy is by invoking external pressure. Then there's some of that. But it is very difficult, especially when we get to the structure of taxation and so on. This becomes very much a political matter, and it's also an economically difficult question. I've been talking about instruments, I mean, I can go on, as if they were there to be freely used, but very often there are constraints on the use of such instruments, be it on fiscal policy for income distribution reasons and so on, political reasons, be it on monetary policy because of the attempt to keep interest rates at a certain level to satisfy fiscal policy, the monetary independence versus fiscal policy, and so on and so forth. Now, in general, all these involve difficult trade-offs, and they tend to be avoided. Okay? And it's always easier, or very often easier, to refuse to take a decision rather than to take a painful one, and then you get into problems. That, of course, is procrastination. That there is never a good time for reform. When things are going badly, you say, well, we can't reform now, the economy is in too bad a state for us to actually do a reform that is going to be painful. Then when things go well, you say, well, why reform? Things are going well. And that's a basic problem of any of those things. And finally, there is the last point you mentioned, which was the first mover problem. Okay? We say, well, the US should say, do this, China should do that, etc., etc. The deficit countries should perhaps tighten, the surplus countries should expand, or maybe if the state of the world economy is very bad as it is now, maybe everybody should expand except the countries that are in surplus should expand more. I suppose a country that is in deficit, which needs to expand, expands first. Then it may get into a vicious circle of depreciation, inflation, etc., because the others haven't done it in time. And similarly for the other side. So the first people, the various countries have to move together. And that's one of the reasons I would say moving the right direction is the important thing, not by how much. Don't try to force countries to do big things and so on. Let them move, but at least let them move in the right direction. But that is obviously not a problem that can be solved in that way. And this brings me to my last point, and I will talk about it only very briefly, which is, can the IMF help solve the international policy coordination problem? Now, what does the IMF have to do with international policy coordination? Well, it does it, if it has anything to say about it, it has to say about it, something to say about it through its surveillance process. And it has, at the national level, Article 4 consultations with all members, once a year or every second year, depends on the importance of the member, made some recommendations on what it thinks about about the policy and so on. In that process, it will also try to see what the impact of what that country is doing on the rest of the world. And there, its multilateral surveillance, if you wish, is basically comes through what it has to say about the exchange rate. And the articles say that the IMF let's try it like this. The article 4 of the Articles of Agreement says that the IMF shall exercise firm surveillance over its members' exchange rate policies. Now, I think that is where, in a way, the focus of policy has come to deal with global imbalances. So it's sort of focused on, is the exchange rate between this currency and that currency at the right level? Is it right? Or has, and that is a big problem between China and the United States, the United States influencing the IMF on that one, and China on the other hand, is a country manipulating its currency, and that's again in the articles on their interpretation, with an intent to prevent adjustment in the balance of payments that has been reinterpreted and modified with harm to the external position of the country. Now, I mean, this is very troublesome because it gets surveillance to surveil outcomes and not policies. It doesn't face up to squarely to the fact that the exchange rate is an endogenous variable. Even if the nominal exchange rate is fixed, the real exchange rate will change and is an endogenous variable, and so is the current account. Now, certainly in the short run, through manipulating the nominal exchange rate, fixing it at different levels, you can affect the real exchange rate, but eventually there will be some adaptation. And again, the exchange rate as well as the current account are not in themselves in fundamental equilibrium or disequilibrium or something of that sort, are not in balance or in imbalance. They are whatever the economic system has made them on the basis of the structures of the economy, on the basis of endowments, tastes, and technologies, on the basis of economic policies. So if you're surveilling policies, what you should be surveilling is the use of the instruments of policy to reach definite goals. And a particular level of the exchange rate is not a goal. I don't think a particular level of the current account should be a goal. Although you may want more, in the latter case, more balance. And that means that for the IMF to be more effective, it needs to shift, and it's beginning to do so because it's realized how unhelpful some of the focus on exchange rates is, to shift the focus from exchange rate surveillance to macroeconomic surveillance in general. The question that has to be asked is, are the particular macroeconomic policies that countries are using, A, consistent with each other, B, consistent with the exchange rate regime that they have chosen? Countries should still be free to choose fixed exchange rates if they want, or flexible exchange rates. But the question is, are the other policies that they're talking about consistent with their choice and consistent with the stability of the international economic system? And that, I think, is important. Now, of course, that gets the IMF, as it already is involved, into problems. Because it starts talking about things that are of vital interest to the member states. And it's sometimes very difficult to do that or to enforce that, except through lending programs and so on. But also that biases the analysis. So I think the second thing is that it would be good to separate more sharply the lending functions, the crisis management function of the IMF from its surveillance mission or function, which would be to give very independent, sharp advice. And of course, the countries may or may not follow them. But where does that leave us with coordination? That is my last point. Here, I think the IMF can play a constructive role by doing two things that could make it more useful. One is if the sort of exercises at policy coordination took place not in the G20, the G3, the G8, and so on, but within the fund. But that means a second thing, that some of those exercises cannot be done with the 192 member states. One is to revive the, whatever it was called, multilateral consultations or special consultations between small groups of countries, for instance, current account imbalances, those that are most directly involved in this. It's not going to be the IMF ordering the country, but it would be, the idea would be to get them together and to lend the capacities of the Secretariat of the IMF management and so on to arbitrate, discuss, and so on. And secondly, I guess, as I already said, it would be to try to bring back some more legitimacy to processes like the G20 by making the G20 overlap. The membership should actually be rather a political IMFC rather than all the council of the IMF and not the G20. But that may be a very Swiss position, since Switzerland has an executive director at the IMF and is not part of the G20, so that may be a bias. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I guess we have time for a few questions. Questions?
Norway did not follow your recommendation with respect to fiscal policy. Could you say why?
Sorry?
Norway did not follow your recommendation.
Norway.
Norway.
I don't have any recommendation for that.
That's exactly. Why? What is the reason? They accumulate results and funds.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now, again, let's be very careful. I won't be careful. I never said that the goal is to obtain balance in the current account. Okay? Not for a single country, not for regions, etc. In fact, this would be terrible, because it would really say if every country's current account from now on was zero, it would mean there are no more net capital flows in the world. And I think that is obviously all wrong. So clearly, current account deficits and surpluses are not to be eliminated. They become worrisome when they are, and this is really what I wanted to emphasize, when they are the result of something else that is inappropriate. In and of themselves, the current account deficits and surpluses, the exchanges are endogenous variables. They are the result of something that is happening somewhere else, or they're simultaneously determined within the general equilibrium economic system. So in the case of Norway, Norway is accumulating, obviously a surplus, an oil surplus, and it's accumulating reserves. And rightly so. It's thinking of its future generations. It has a sovereign wealth fund. That's their choice, and that's perfectly fine. There's absolutely no problem with that. I would say that for the rest of the world, the fact that China was buying all those US Treasury bills and so on is not really a problem, or not until it gets combined with a number of other policies like exchange rate policies and so on, where it's a minor, I would still say not a terribly important problem for the rest of the world, a major problem. It may become a major problem for China itself. Okay. So please don't understand me to say that.
Oh, we would say that example with Norway completely at least the distribution of the mature creditor from the development textbooks 50 years ago. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Capital flowing from rich country to poor countries, and Norway is saving. It's not only flowing to rich and poor countries, but Norway is saving and living off the rent. So, yes.
So you mentioned now the story. So G20 representatives from 20 countries sit over a round table, each having a proposal how to resolve divorce and imbalances. Okay? And then IMF comes and says, we have a proposal. Now, question is, why would they do this? Because IMF have a better expertise, because impartiality, some other reasons. Why would, how exactly IMF fits into this?
Okay.
This is very much on the agenda in this country, and whenever Russia, India, and China meet together, they also think about these issues. Why should we listen to
I think the answer to that is that you shouldn't listen to people sitting in DC. You should be sitting in DC or anywhere else with those people talking about the problems. And again, I don't think by the way, what you say brings up another problem with the IMF, of course, is its legitimacy with a number of countries, representation and so on. I think here the share of votes is not terribly important. Yes, it has to be shifted, but this is not going to make much difference. But it's a role of the members of the executive board, and they don't really perhaps have enough influence. Enough independence from their capitals. Their capitals don't have a political council. I mean, there are all these problems. But I would not for a moment think that the IMF would get anywhere if it came and said, "Look, here is our solution." Okay? I think it would be much better if the countries get together and talk about it. But it would mean not only that the BRICS say to hell with those guys, it would mean that the BRICS agree among themselves, perhaps, but especially sit at the table with the US, with some representative from the Europeans, maybe somebody from oil producers, and start discussing what are the sort of simple measures, which direction do we want to move? Again, and where is the IMF in all that? The IMF should provide assistance from its secretariat, but not to be called in from outside. I worked briefly at the IMF. Fortunately, I was on the research side and so on, so that wasn't that. But when I saw the time that was spent by the staff of superbly intelligent people responding to the requests from the G10, from the G20, from the G7, from the G8, for position papers on this, for position papers on that. It was becoming a secretariat of all those groups. I think it should be a secretariat to the community of countries that are represented at the IMF, through the IMF, and not through that. But in practice, what does it mean? It means it doesn't come with a plan. It sits at the table, it listens to various people, it comes with its own suggestions. Whether anything much is going to come out of it, I don't know. I mean, it is a little bit pie in the sky, I'm afraid.
Let me ask a question which everybody's interested in. Given that coordination is probably limited, and is going to remain limited to most extent, what do you think is going to happen to the US dollar? If you think about this huge budget deficit now and the debt which is growing to almost 100% of GDP 10 years down the road, how is this problem going to be resolved? If you look at the markets just pricing something like 2% inflation a year. If you look at the TIPS and straight loans, it's very hard to imagine how these numbers will add up over the last 10 years. Is there some kind of productivity?
No, my prediction is going to be worth what you have just paid for it, which is nothing. So no, I mean I don't want to predict what the dollar is going to do. I haven't the foggiest idea. My wife is an investment advisor. She has to take a view on that. I don't know how she right. I don't know how she does it. And so on. I mean, the only thing we know as economists is that exchange rates are very hard to predict, among other things. That said, I don't see. I mean, if you look at the history of currencies, it's hard to believe that the dollar will cease being the major currency for at least the next 10 years, and a major currency for at least the next 30. And then I won't be here in the 130, so I don't care. This is a cheap prediction. Now, what that means in terms of, is it going to depreciate from where it is now in nominal terms? I really don't know. And over what horizon? Does it mean that it will depreciate in real terms much more? On average, not necessarily. I mean, it's quite surprising if you look at the evolution of the dollar in real terms over time, how it sort of, over 40 years or so, it's depreciated, but steadily and by very small amounts. So, I mean, if you take a moving average or long-term trend. So, I don't know. Whether the euro is going to become more important. Well, let me say that, first, barring a catastrophe in the United States, something really stupid, which is not impossible. I think it's terribly likely. I don't think that the US is going to tolerate runaway inflation. So I don't expect that. But I do get worried about, about the near-term prospects. Anyway, the euro is going to become more important as the market for euro obligations develops and so on. It's already becoming much more important in the reserves of countries as an international reserve currency. It still isn't really an international private currency, or doesn't play that role as much as it will. And then what else? I don't really believe in an artificial unit or man-made currency. Maybe there will be some sort of an asset created by an international organization with a common thing, which will be a parallel currency to the ones we have. But that will take a long time and will take very hard decisions on the part of countries on how they want to include that in their pegging arrangements or use it and so on. So I don't think that will come for a while. As for the yuan or renminbi, as you prefer, nothing will become a more important currency. Maybe in 20 years it will begin to be an international currency, but it won't be a serious one for a much longer time. Now, on the near term, I do get worried. On the near term, I do get worried because I think the problem we haven't talked about here is the state of the banking and financial system, which is pretty terrible. And the interplay between the real economy and the state of the financial system over the next 2 years. I'm afraid I'm not a Bush person, but I'm a W person.
Well, W is not the worst letter. There is also letter M. Other questions? We have time for probably one more question. Okay, we just a bit late, so let me thank Alexander again and.